The room fell silent the moment he appeared, quiet not out of respect, but because no one expected someone like him to claim this space. Clad in a uniform that spoke of battles fought far from here, he became the target of scorn before a single word left his lips. The weight of unseen judgments pressed down, suffocating and relentless. Yet beneath that burden simmered a force no one anticipated. What unfolds is a collision between authority and truth, where a hidden power threatens to upend the very walls built to contain it. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. If you're ready to see justice tear through prejudice, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. This fight belongs to all of us. The glass doors yawned open to a draft of damp street air and the metallic hush of early footsteps, while the lobby lights hummed above polished stone that reflected faint stripes of winter sun. He reset the velvet queue ropes by a pointless inch, straightened a stack of deposit envelopes that didn't need straightening, and studied his reflection in the privacy tint of his windowed office, testing the angle of a practiced smile he reserved for donors and councilmen. The building felt obedient to him. The brass rail cool beneath his trailing fingertips, the clock hands compliant, the printers clicking out paper in staccato nods that matched his sense of control. Then Ezekiel Ward entered with the quiet steadiness of someone used to doors opening late and lines moving slow, a veteran's capped shadowing eyes that measured the room rather than pleading with it. Nothing in Ezekiel's posture asked permission. Everything in Vernon's posture denied it anyway. Vernon's gaze slid from cap to boots with a cool assessment, absorbing scuffs, and seems the way a customs agent might inventory contraband. He didn't say a word, he didn't have to. His chin rose by half an inch, a private semaphore of dismissal that felt as satisfying as a slammed door. Ezekiel paused to read the rake placard nobody ever read, then approached the manager's counter with a leather folder whose corners had been softened by travel and time. Vernon's hand, already closing around a pen, pivoted instead toward a sanitizing wipe. He pressed the cloth along the exact segment of marble Ezekiel's knuckles had grazed, rubbing in slow concentric circles that left a wet halo, then flicked the wipe into a bin as if it had performed heroic duty. The gesture was unhurried and performative, choreographed to be noticed by the man it pretended not to acknowledge. Behind Ezekiel, the queue whispered forward, shoes murmuring across tile, a stroller squeaking with an off-tempo wheel. The camera over the vestibule blinked red. The safe door clicked once as a timer advanced. The vault guard cleared his throat and returned to his stool. Vernon lifted Ezekiel's folder with finger and thumb precision, pinching at a corner like a maitre d', inspecting a suspect reservation card, then let the papers fan across the counter with an airy carelessness that dared gravity to interfere. A signature page wandered toward the edge. Vernon made no rescue attempt. He glanced past Ezekiel to the next customer as if triaging importance by silhouette, shrugged internally at his own verdict, and introduced a delay so subtle it might almost look like diligence. He booted a reconciliation screen he didn't need, minimized it, reopened it, frowned at a column of figures he already knew, and typed 3 purposeless keystrokes that produced a scolding beep. He removed his watch, polished its face with a microfiber square, and set it down 3 inches left of its usual place, as though recalibrating time itself for the benefit of the unworthy. Ezekiel remained still, hands relaxed on the folder, eyes steady, breathing the slow, measured breath of someone counting to a number no one else could guess. Vernon felt the weight of that composure and answered it with pettier gravity, sliding a laminated placard, service hours, holiday closures, a charitable drive whose logo smiled too brightly, directly between Ezekiel and the transactional well, interposing plastic policy, where an open sight line had been. He capped his pen with a prim, get what you get click, and turned his shoulder inches away, creating a diagonal sliver of distance that read like a closed curtain. The lobby soundscape swelled and thinned, a door chime, a cough, an ATM receipt tearing free with a papery sigh, and Vernon harvested each noise as cover for the next small affront. He moved Ezekiel's driver's license with the back of a fingernail instead of the pad of a finger, then arranged it beside a highlighter whose fluorescent ink had dried last spring, a deliberate pairing of verification and uselessness. When a teller at window 2 called for assistance with a counterfeit check alert, Vernon raised one finger without looking, a gesture that said wait not only to the teller, but to the veteran who had not asked for help. He opened a desk drawer, felt the smooth topography of his office supplies, bypassed the stamp he needed, and came up with a paper clip, which he unbent meticulously into a steel filament and used to nudge a single page back into imperfect alignment. The page wandered left again. He allowed it. The choreography deepened. He tuned the air. One sigh measured. One faint shake of the head. One almost smile that contained no warmth, only the private thrill of control. He rotated the marble nameplate so his title faced himself rather than the lobby, a possessive pivot that changed nothing except the temperature of the encounter. He raised the transaction gate halfway, high enough to imply a process was underway, low enough to block easy exchange, and drifted toward the sanitizer pump to depress it twice, letting cool gel coil and evaporate from his palms while the clock over the vault marked the seconds with frugal ticks. Ezekiel set a pen beside the folder, as if building an island of order inside another man's weather. Vernon felt his pulse settle into the feline calm of cruelty without witness, then arranged for witnesses. He pulled a portable sign from beneath the counter, "Please form a single line," and planted it off-center so that the queue now angled past Ezekiel's shoulder, forcing strangers to pass close enough to register an invented problem. He let his gaze flick from Ezekiel to the sign and back, a loop that composed a story the room could absorb without words. A woman in a gray coat hesitated, glanced at the cap, looked away with a practiced civilian neutrality. A teenager with earbuds glanced once too long, and then pretended to study the security camera as if it were a piece of modern art. Vernon's posture grew more erect, his elbows narrowing, his silhouette accepting and amplifying the authority the furniture offered. He reopened the folder and found a form that could have been processed in 30 seconds. He folded it gently in half, pressed the crease with his thumbnail, unfolded it, and splayed atop a laminated brochure about mortgage refinancing that would not interest the man in front of him. From under the counter, he pulled a cloth and began rubbing the same spot again, an unspoken message that whatever Ezekiel had touched now required cleansing. Customers in the queue shifted their weight, some glancing at their watches, but Vernon seemed immune to the growing impatience. Ezekiel stood silently, his broad shoulders squared, his boots firmly planted, his eyes steady and calm under the brim of his cap. The manager let the silence grow thick, as though daring the man to break it. Instead, Ezekiel kept still, which only made Vernon more determined to get a reaction. He reached for a stack of forms and deliberately set them atop Ezekiel's folder, half covering the military documents the man had so carefully prepared. Without asking, Vernon took out a pen and began jotting unrelated notes on a yellow pad, letting the pen scrape slowly across the paper, the noise loud in the otherwise hushed lobby. The second teller to Vernon's left finished with her customer, and, seeing the veteran still standing unattended, started to approach to offer help. Vernon caught her eye and gave a small shake of his head, sending her back to her station without a word. The move was quiet but unmistakably territorial. This interaction was his, and no one else was going to interfere. He finally picked up one of the veteran's documents, held it up to the light as though questioning its authenticity, then set it down again without comment. Vernon opened a drawer, took out a stamp, and pressed it onto an ink pad with exaggerated care, pausing to adjust the alignment before bringing it down slowly on a blank sheet of paper. Not on any of Ezekiel's forms, just to make a dull, pointless thump that broke the stillness. The older woman in line behind Ezekiel let out an impatient sigh. Vernon looked past Ezekiel to her, offered a courteous nod, then returned his attention to his pointless task. Ezekiel's gaze never wavered, though a muscle in his jaw flexed briefly. Vernon noticed and considered it progress. He pushed the folder an inch closer to himself, but then leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the counter as he glanced toward the glass doors at the front of the bank. Outside, a delivery truck pulled up. He seized the opportunity for another delay, reaching for his phone and dialing the front desk clerk to ask about an incoming package, dragging out the conversation in a tone loud enough for Ezekiel to hear. "Yeah, hold it there. I'll deal with it later," Vernon said casually before hanging up and returning to the folder with mock seriousness. As if remembering something vital, he stood, walked into the back office with the veteran's documents in hand, and disappeared for nearly 3 minutes. When he returned, he set the folder down as though it were suddenly heavier, then pulled out a magnifying glass from his drawer and began inspecting the smallest printed numbers. A teenage teller passing by shot him a puzzled look. Vernon ignored it, taking his time over every page. With each unnecessary pause, his actions were saying more than words ever could. "You're not important here." At one point, Vernon slid a paper halfway toward Ezekiel as though to return it, but then pulled it back before the man could take it, flipping it open again as though reconsidering. The humiliation was deliberate, precise, and it unfolded in small, layered gestures, a man asserting control in the pettiest ways possible. Vernon wasn't just processing documents. He was staging a performance for an audience of one. Customers shuffled forward in line, some craning to see what was taking so long. A man in a baseball cap muttered under his breath, and a woman near the back frowned at the manager's drawn-out handling. Vernon ignored them all. He reached for his coffee mug, took a slow sip, and set it down exactly on top of one corner of Ezekiel's folder, the base of the cup leaving a faint ring on the leather. If he noticed, Ezekiel didn't show it. Finally, Vernon let out a quiet, theatrical sigh, gathered the papers, and placed them neatly back in the folder, but not before rotating it so the veteran would have to turn it around to access them properly. He set it down not at his counter, but a few feet away from it, right in the main path where customers passed, and gestured toward it with a pointed lift of his chin. Ezekiel neither moved nor reacted, so Vernon stood, took the man's folder off the counter without a word, and placed it on that chair in the middle of the room. He then returned to his desk, creating a scenario where the veteran would have to follow his work into the public eye if he wanted to continue. Customers glanced at each other, unsure why someone's paperwork was now on display like a misplaced item in Lost and Found. Vernon pretended to be absorbed in his computer, though he was acutely aware of the shift in the lobby's energy. Whispers traveled from one end of the line to the other. A man near the front frowned in confusion, and a young woman in a floral scarf tilted her head toward Ezekiel, as if silently asking if he was all right. Vernon ignored them all, his eyes occasionally flicking up to catch the way the scene was being absorbed by his unintentional audience. When Ezekiel finally stepped forward to retrieve the folder, Vernon seized the moment to rise again, this time opening the heavy door to the cash vault just enough to let its metallic groan fill the space. He left it ajar and returned to the counter without locking it, then rifled through a drawer until he found a set of oversized account ledgers, thick and heavy with outdated records. He stacked them on the counter directly in front of him, deliberately blocking the view of anyone who might want to see what he was doing, then glanced toward Ezekiel as though expecting him to wait while something far more important was handled. But the real theater was about to begin. Vernon pressed the intercom button to the side of his station and paged the vault guard, his voice carrying through the bank speakers so that everyone heard the unnecessary request for a temporary security presence in the lobby. The guard, a tall man with a broad frame, emerged from the back and stood a few feet from Ezekiel, his stance casual, but his proximity suggestive. Vernon made no effort to explain why the guard was there. The implication was enough. Conversations in the queue dropped to murmurs. Customers glanced between the veteran and the looming security figure, their expressions registering curiosity, judgment, or discomfort. Vernon basked in it. He leaned on the counter, arms folded, while pretending to scan an incoming email. Every so often he let his gaze wander toward Ezekiel, then shift quickly away as though dismissing him, an old trick to make someone feel like a disruption rather than a guest. To add to the spectacle, Vernon stepped around the counter and approached a standing promotional display near the entrance, one of those retractable banners advertising the bank's community outreach programs. He rotated it so that it partially blocked the main walkway, forcing customers to detour closer to where Ezekiel was standing. Now nearly every person entering the bank would have to pass by the veteran, their eyes catching on his cap, his boots, and the fact that he was conspicuously positioned away from the usual counters. A mother ushering her child through shot a quick glance and then looked away, gripping her daughter's hand tighter. Two men in business suits exchanged a look as they passed, their eyebrows lifting slightly as they moved on. Vernon returned to his station, the corners of his mouth tightening in satisfaction. This was no longer a quiet inconvenience, it was a staged isolation, and he intended to keep it that way until the man showed some sign of straying. When Ezekiel did not, Vernon pushed further. He picked up the veteran's folder and, without looking, dropped it onto a rolling cart filled with miscellaneous items headed for the records room. The folder landed at an angle, threatening to slide off with the cart's first movement. He gave the cart a shove toward the hallway, making Ezekiel follow it a few steps before it stopped near a low counter where the guard still lingered. Vernon busied himself with a stack of mail, the kind of work that could have been done at any time, all the while letting the scene speak for itself. The message was simple and cutting. Your business is not important here, but your presence will be noticed, and not for the right reasons. A faint unease rippled through the customers. Even those who might not have understood the intent could feel the imbalance. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was joined by the faint tapping of keys from other tellers. But for Vernon, all of it was background score to the performance he was conducting. He glanced toward the guard, a subtle nod prompting the man to adjust his stance so that he blocked one of the aisle paths entirely. Customers were now funneled even closer to Ezekiel, brushing past him, their eyes sliding away, lingering or narrowing depending on their disposition. A young man with earbuds in one ear slowed to glance at the folder perched precariously on the cart, then looked up at Ezekiel's cap before hurrying away. Vernon fed on these glances like applause. He took a tall stool from the side wall and rolled it, wheels squeaking, into the open space in front of his counter. It was not for Ezekiel to sit on. Instead, he placed a stack of outdated promotional brochures atop it, then began sorting them with exaggerated care, his hands moving each one as if it contained state secrets. The stool's placement forced anyone heading to the deposit slips to veer around Ezekiel, heightening the sense that he was an obstacle in the room. Vernon's peripheral vision tracked every micro-interaction. Someone's raised brow, a slight shake of the head from a man in line, the faint grimace of a woman who clearly disliked what she was seeing but didn't intervene. He decided it was time to inject noise into the scene. Crossing to the teller beside him, Vernon exchanged a few low words, then took the portable cash counting machine from her station and set it on his counter. The machine roared to life with a rapid mechanical shuffle, spitting out bills in a blur. It was loud, obtrusive, and unnecessary, and it drew attention like a magnet. Vernon angled his body so that Ezekiel was in the line of sight behind the machine, forcing the mental connection. Noisy activity at the counter, isolated man under security watch. The sensory pairing was not accidental. He paused the counter, fanned a stack of bills theatrically, then let them rest half spread across the counter as he made a show of checking each for authenticity. Customers nearby craned their necks, curious. The security guard shifted again, moving so close to Ezekiel that the hem of his jacket brushed the veteran's arm. Vernon noted the slight tightening of Ezekiel's posture, but saw no other reaction, no loss of composure. That only drove him to push further. He rolled the cart with the folder a few feet closer to the vault entrance, then stepped away as though it no longer concerned him. Ezekiel followed the movement with his eyes, but stayed where he was. Vernon's voice cut through the lobby as he called for an assistant manager to make a note about misplaced customer documents, loud enough for those waiting to hear. It was a lie, a fabricated issue designed to cast subtle doubt in the air around Ezekiel. The assistant manager, a young woman named Marla, hesitated before approaching, her expression unsure. Vernon handed her a blank slip of paper, instructing her to file this for later, before sending her back to her station. The point wasn't the paper, it was the optics. Customers saw an authority figure summoning subordinates to handle what appeared to be a problem tied to the man standing alone. To cement the scene, Vernon pulled out a red, temporarily out of service sign and set it on the counter where Ezekiel had originally been. It had no bearing on the transaction, but it symbolically closed off that space, declaring it unavailable as long as Ezekiel was there. He stepped back, folded his arms, and scanned the lobby as if checking for compliance. The energy in the room shifted, quieter conversations, occasional glances at the veteran, an almost tangible discomfort that Vernon mistook for validation. He leaned over the counter toward the nearest teller and murmured something that made her frown, then laughed softly in a way that carried just far enough. It was not humor in the traditional sense. It was the sharp, brittle laughter of someone caught between social obligation and unease. Ezekiel didn't move. His eyes held steady, his breathing even, but his stance radiated an unshakable weight, like a rooted post in the middle of a current. Vernon walked to the end of the counter and retrieved a heavy 3-ring binder of policy documents. He opened it flat on the counter, turning the pages slowly, each one making a soft snapping sound as it fell. At a particularly thick section, he stopped and left it open, then looked directly toward the spot where Ezekiel's folder sat unattended on the cart. With deliberate casualness, he closed the binder and set it directly on top of his own neatly stacked work, as though nothing in the room required his urgent attention. Not the man waiting, not the line of customers, not the displaced documents under silent guard. He returned to his computer and began typing slowly, his eyes occasionally flicking up to gauge the crowd. The guard remained beside Ezekiel, an unmoving shadow, while the displaced chair, cart, and sign created a silent perimeter around the man. It was no longer just a transaction. It was an arrangement Vernon had curated, a living display of subtle dominance in full public view. What Vernon failed to see was that, for some customers, the discomfort was no longer silent. A man near the back of the line whispered something to the woman beside him, who nodded with a tight-lipped frown. Another customer, just leaving after making a deposit, glanced back twice before stepping out into the cold air beyond the glass doors. Without any announcement, Vernon stepped away from his station and moved toward the tall cabinet behind the teller row, where several customer files sat in labeled bins, and after glancing over his shoulder to ensure that Ezekiel's eyes followed, he selected a random bin and placed it conspicuously on the counter beside the veteran's folder, creating a stack that looked like ordinary work but was positioned so the folder now rested on top of an unstable pile. Vernon then opened the cabinet's upper compartment, reached in, and deliberately removed a bundle of manila folders that had nothing to do with Ezekiel's transaction, flipping through them page by page with slow, calculated disinterest before setting them on the very top of the already teetering stack. He made no move to steady the pile, letting gravity make it wobble, as though any careless motion from Ezekiel might send his own papers tumbling to the floor. The security guard remained fixed beside the veteran, eyes occasionally scanning the room, but mostly fixed forward, his presence amplifying the visual suggestion that this man needed watching. A customer near the deposit slip counter noticed the precarious pile and glanced from it to Ezekiel with faint concern, but Vernon's deliberate motions conveyed to anyone watching that everything was under control, and no one intervened. Returning to his seat, Vernon picked up a desk phone and dialed an internal extension, speaking just loud enough for Ezekiel and those nearby to hear phrases like misplaced record and need verification before setting the receiver down with a soft, deliberate click. Then, without touching the veteran's folder, he pulled a blank form from a drawer and began filling it out, pausing after each line to consult a laminated reference sheet in a way that projected officious necessity while consuming precious minutes. Each time the pen hovered above the page, Vernon's eyes flicked toward the line of customers, noting their subtle fidgeting, then back to Ezekiel, whose face remained steady, though his hands now rested loosely on the edge of the counter. When the form was complete, Vernon rose again, taking the veteran's folder in one hand and the blank form in the other, walking toward a narrow hallway that led to the bank's internal processing area. But before disappearing from view, he set both items on top of a high shelf just inside the hallway entrance, leaving them there as though they were simply part of a queue of pending work. He returned empty-handed, a small twist of satisfaction curling through him at the thought of the folder now being out of reach, without Ezekiel crossing into staff-only space. To the untrained eye, it looked like an ordinary pause in workflow. To Vernon, it was another layer of control. Sitting back down, he took up a stack of routine mail and began sorting it, occasionally setting envelopes aside to open, his letter opener gliding under flaps with deliberate slowness. Each slice of paper was a quiet theft of seconds, each glance toward the untouched shelf a silent reminder to Ezekiel that his business would move only when Vernon allowed it. The guard shifted his weight, the creak of leather drawing brief attention from customers, and then repositioned himself so that he partially blocked Ezekiel's view of the shelf where the folder rested. Vernon decided it was time for another physical barrier. So he reached beneath the counter and retrieved the collapsible rope stand normally used to guide lines during high traffic. With two loud, metallic clicks, he extended the posts and connected the rope between them, placing it diagonally in front of the service area as though reconfiguring the lobby for efficiency, though in reality it positioned the rope between Ezekiel and any direct access to the counter. Customers entering the bank now had to snake awkwardly around the rope, some shooting puzzled glances at the arrangement, others brushing past Ezekiel more closely than before. Vernon ignored their reactions, feigning concentration on his screen while he let the awkward flow of bodies feed the sense of disruption he was manufacturing. At one point, a woman in a navy blazer stepped toward the counter to ask a question, but Vernon, without looking up, directed her toward the farthest teller station, dismissing her approach with a flick of his wrist. The dismissal was not about her. It was another signal to Ezekiel that proximity to Vernon's workspace was a privilege to be granted or withheld at will. Rising again, Vernon finally retrieved the veteran's folder from the shelf, but instead of bringing it back to his counter, he carried it to the customer waiting area and set it on a side table stacked with outdated magazines, positioning it between a curled-up sports section and a flyer for a community blood drive. He then returned to his counter empty-handed, glancing only briefly in Ezekiel's direction, the barest flicker of a smirk tugging at one corner of his mouth. To complete the impression of bureaucratic necessity, Vernon began typing into his computer, this time pulling up a form clearly marked incident log in bold at the top. He typed slowly, pausing to read each line before entering information, knowing that anyone walking past could see the heading. He didn't need to log anything, there was no real incident, but the visible form served as a visual prop, reinforcing the fiction that there was some irregularity in progress. Customers continued their transactions under the muted hum of the bank's machinery, but the atmosphere felt slightly strained, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Ezekiel still did not move toward the folder on the side table. Instead, he stood as he had been, eyes steady, boots planted, his composure forming an unspoken barrier stronger than any rope or rearranged furniture. Vernon interpreted the lack of movement as stubbornness, and stubbornness was a challenge. He stood once more, walked deliberately to the folder, and retrieved it with the exaggerated care one might show an object of great fragility. Returning to his counter, he set it down as though now, finally, the transaction might resume, but rather than open it, he reached for his coffee mug, took a slow sip, and began flipping through the mail again, letting each second stretch longer than it needed to. Instead, he swiveled toward the printer beside his station and fed in a stack of paper, initiating a print job that coughed out page after page of irrelevant bank memos, each landing in the tray with a faint slap. He let the pile grow, not bothering to collect them, the rhythmic sound an intentional metronome for wasted time. The guard remained stationed near Ezekiel, arms folded, gaze scanning the room in slow arcs, but his stance still suggested that the man beside him was the reason for his presence. Vernon rose, lifted the folder, and with a casual flick of his wrist, set it atop the mound of freshly printed pages. Then, without a word, he began sifting through the stack, lifting the folder occasionally only to set it back down again, each movement designed to look like searching for something important when in truth he was doing nothing but shuffling paper. He could sense eyes on them, customers wondering why this man in uniform waited so long, why a manager seemed so determined to busy himself with everything but the transaction at hand. Vernon welcomed those glances, feeding them with small cues, like the slight narrowing of his eyes when he looked at Ezekiel, or the pointed way he adjusted his tie before turning away. Deciding to involve another staff member for added weight, Vernon beckoned to a junior teller named Bryant, a nervous young man who obeyed quickly. In a voice pitched just high enough to carry, Vernon instructed Bryant to double-check these records and handed him the folder. Bryant's confused glance flicked toward Ezekiel, but he took the folder and retreated toward the back office, his hesitation adding another layer of delay. Vernon returned to his counter empty-handed, pulled out a drawer filled with loose coins, and began counting them slowly, letting the metallic clinks punctuate the air. The guard shifted his stance again, this time stepping a little closer to Ezekiel, their shoulders nearly aligned. A woman leaving the bank looked back at the pair twice before disappearing through the doors. Minutes passed before Bryant returned, setting the folder on the far end of the counter without a word. Vernon didn't touch it. Instead, he reached for a small plastic sign that read "Closed" in bold red letters and placed it directly in front of the folder, a visual declaration that whatever business was tied to that leather case was halted. He then stood, crossed the lobby to the far teller station, and engaged in a deliberately drawn-out conversation about interest rate adjustments, his voice low, but his eyes occasionally glancing toward Ezekiel. The move forced the veteran to stand unattended in the center of the room, his transaction literally closed off in plain view of everyone. When Vernon returned, he lifted the closed sign slowly, set aside, and finally opened the folder as though he were at last ready to proceed. But almost immediately, he pulled out a single sheet, frowned, and tapped it against the counter twice before setting it aside. Without explaining the gesture, he reached for the phone and called the records department, spinning his chair slightly so his back was to Ezekiel as he spoke. "Yes, I need to confirm an account number. No, it's for a pending case," he said, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. The phrase "pending case" was deliberate, a small linguistic hook meant to catch the ears of nearby customers. He ended the call with a curt "fine" and hung up without further action. Then, as if struck by sudden inspiration, Vernon removed several sheets from the folder and spread them across the counter, aligning their edges meticulously while scanning them with exaggerated concentration. The folder's remaining contents he slid to the far corner of the counter, just out of Ezekiel's immediate reach. He looked up briefly, meeting the veteran's eyes for the first time in several minutes, his expression unreadable, but his gaze steady, before looking down again and marking something with his pen. Behind them, a man in line muttered something under his breath. Another customer crossed their arms and stared openly at the scene. Vernon noticed, but pretended not to, focusing instead on jotting meaningless numbers in the margins of one form. He took a slow breath, leaned back, and glanced at the wall clock, making a show of checking the time as if to suggest that the morning was slipping away and that the delay was somehow justified. Then, breaking the rhythm, he stood abruptly, gathered all the papers back into the folder, and carried it toward the staff-only hallway. But instead of disappearing with it, he stopped at the threshold, turned on his heel, and walked back, placing the folder squarely in front of Ezekiel. For a moment, it seemed like the charade might end. But then Vernon stepped away again, this time to retrieve a stamp pad from the supply cabinet. He tested the pad with 3 firm presses of the stamp onto scrap paper, each leaving a neat blue impression, before applying it to one corner of a form in the folder. The stamp was purely decorative, its wording irrelevant to the matter at hand, but Vernon closed the folder afterward with a definitive thud, as if something official had just occurred. He slid the folder closer to himself instead of to Ezekiel, rested his elbows on the counter, and laced his fingers together, looking down the line of customers as though calculating who might be next. The guard hadn't moved. Ezekiel hadn't either. But what Vernon didn't notice was the slight shift in the room, how the air felt more alert now, how customers no longer averted their eyes, but held them longer on the pair at the counter, sensing an undercurrent they couldn't yet name. Vernon adjusted his tie again, a tick more than a necessity, and decided it was time for another verification. He slid the folder away from himself and stacked 3 unrelated files on top of it, the move looking casual, but calculated to bury the veteran's business under meaningless work. Then he picked up the stack, walked to the farthest teller station, and began explaining, in his deliberate, too slow voice, how certain documents needed cross-checking before they could be processed. He knew the words were vague, but vagueness was part of the intimidation. Customers overhearing would fill in the blanks however they liked. While he was speaking, Ezekiel shifted his weight subtly, his boots scuffing the tile with a soft scrape. Vernon glanced over in time to see the veteran's gaze move across the lobby toward the main entrance, lingering on the framed photographs of the building's dedication ceremony that hung on the wall. There was something in that glance, not defiance, not annoyance, but quiet recognition, that unsettled Vernon for a fraction of a second before he pushed it aside. Returning to his own station, Vernon set the stack down and deliberately placed the veteran's folder at the bottom again. He opened the top file and began flipping pages, his eyes scanning lines he didn't need to read, his hand occasionally making a note in the margin. Ezekiel stood as he had for the last half hour, unblinking and still, but Vernon caught the faintest upward twitch at the corner of the man's mouth when two customers whispered behind him. That twitch bothered him. It felt like the veteran knew something Vernon didn't. Determined to reassert control, Vernon lifted the folder at last and opened it halfway, just enough to look like progress, before snapping it shut and announcing that he needed one last confirmation from the property record department. He didn't expect anyone to care about the specifics, but this time, something in the way he said it made the nearest customer, a man in a brown overcoat, frown and glance from Vernon to Ezekiel with interest. Vernon placed the folder under his arm and began walking toward the back offices, but Ezekiel's voice, low, calm, and carrying just enough to reach the nearby customers, stopped him. "Before you make that call," Ezekiel said, his tone even, "you might want to check the name on the deed." The words were not loud, not sharp, but they landed with precision. Vernon froze for a half second, his back still to the lobby, before turning slowly. "Excuse me," he asked, as though the statement were nothing more than an inconvenience. But in that instant, something in the energy of the room shifted more noticeably. The customers closest to the counter leaned slightly forward, their curiosity piqued. Ezekiel didn't move from where he stood. "The deed," he said again, and his eyes flicked briefly toward the framed photographs on the wall, then back to Vernon. "Check it." The guard glanced between them, clearly unsure whether this was still part of the slow dance he'd been witnessing or the beginning of something else. Vernon's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll handle this through the normal process," he said, trying to keep his voice flat. But there was a faint edge of defensiveness he couldn't quite mask. He turned as if to leave again, but now Ezekiel stepped forward. Not abruptly, not in aggression, but with the quiet certainty of someone moving into ground he already owned. "You've been looking at my paperwork for the better part of an hour," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying a calm authority that cut through the rustle of the queue. "And you've been doing it in a building you don't own." The last three words hung there almost casual, but weighted enough that Vernon felt a flicker of unease beneath his irritation. A few customers exchanged quick glances. One whispered something to another, and the subtle hum of the lobby shifted again. Vernon forced a short, dismissive laugh. "What does that have to do with your transaction?" "More than you realize," Ezekiel replied, and though he didn't raise his voice, the steadiness of it made the space between them feel smaller. Vernon realized too late that his attempt to keep the man in a silent corner had instead drawn a kind of audience to the exchange. The security guard straightened, his eyes now on Vernon instead of Ezekiel. "Let's finish the process," Vernon said, trying to sound as if the interruption meant nothing. But as he set the folder down on the counter and flipped it open again, his eyes betrayed a brief, involuntary flick toward the wall where the dedication photographs hung. The largest frame contained an image of the building's ribbon cutting years ago, the former mayor smiling beside two men, one of them younger, clean-shaven, but unmistakably Ezekiel Ward, standing in the same composed way he stood now. Vernon's hand hesitated on the folder, the pause just long enough for customers who were watching closely to notice. He forced himself to look down again, to keep turning pages as though the sight meant nothing. But that fraction of hesitation had already opened a crack in the performance. Ezekiel said nothing further, letting the moment breathe, letting Vernon stew in the awareness that something he didn't understand had just entered the game. The guard took a half step back from Ezekiel, as if recalibrating his position. The murmur in the line was faint but steady now. Eyes darted between the two men, and though Vernon tried to ignore it, he felt the control he had been so sure of begin to shift underfoot. Ezekiel, sensing the subtle shift, straightened slightly, the military posture returning with quiet authority, as if he were stepping into a role long prepared for. The guard stationed beside him subtly relaxed his stance, and a curious tension spread among the onlookers, a silent anticipation that something momentous was about to unfold. Vernon cleared his throat, masking the turmoil behind practiced politeness, and said, "Sir, if you have proof of ownership, please provide it so we can proceed." Ezekiel didn't reach for the folder or his wallet. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a sleek, leather-bound case. He opened it carefully and pulled out a large, embossed document, the official deed to the building housing the bank, the signature and seal unmistakable and authoritative. The room seemed to pause as Vernon's gaze locked on the deed, his face a mixture of disbelief and dawning respect, while customers and staff alike leaned in, sensing the gravity of the moment. Ezekiel spoke softly but firmly. "This bank operates within my property. Your tenancy depends on my terms." The weight of the statement rippled through the bank. Murmurs spread like wildfire as whispers exchanged glances. Vernon's eyes narrowed, and he slowly stood, stepping around the counter toward Ezekiel with a posture that tried to reclaim authority, but now felt tentative. The guard moved beside Vernon, perhaps unconsciously seeking alignment with the manager's faltering confidence. Vernon extended a hand toward Ezekiel, a gesture half apology, half acknowledgement. But Ezekiel did not take it. Instead, he folded the deed carefully and placed it back in the case, then looked directly into Vernon's eyes and said, "I suggest you reconsider how you treat those who serve your institution." The statement hung like a gavel strike, clear and final. Around them, customers who had been watching the scene unfold began to speak in hushed tones, some nodding in approval, others shaking their heads at the manager's prior behavior. A few employees, previously hesitant, exchanged looks that suggested a reckoning was underway. Vernon's shoulders slumped slightly as the full realization of his misjudgment settled upon him. The power dynamics had shifted in a single moment. The man he had tried to humiliate held all the leverage, and Vernon's petty cruelties were exposed as empty posturing. Ezekiel stepped back, his stance unchanged, but his aura now unmistakably one of control. He addressed the assembled staff and customers with a quiet authority that demanded respect. "This bank will conduct itself with professionalism and respect, or it will answer to me directly." As Ezekiel stood firm, his presence no longer just that of a customer, but of the very man who owned the walls around them. Vernon's steps back toward his desk were cautious, his movements lacking their previous decisiveness. His usual smirk was replaced by a tight line, and the calculated gestures that once conveyed superiority were now hesitant, uncertain. The guard stationed near Ezekiel lowered his gaze, no longer a barrier, but a silent witness to the shifting balance. The customers, who had until recently been passive observers or whispered onlookers, now leaned forward, their interest sharpened into expectation. A few whispered comments floated through the lobby. "Did you know? He owns the whole building. No wonder the manager's been acting like that." Vernon cleared his throat, the sound seeming too loud in the suddenly quiet space, and spoke, "Mr. Ward, I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. We will address this matter immediately." His voice was measured but lacked its usual confidence, as if even he sensed how hollow the words felt in the wake of the revelation. Ezekiel met his gaze evenly, not with anger or triumph, but with a steady calm that seemed to fill the space with an unspoken command. "Apologies are a start," he said, his tone smooth but carrying the weight of command. "But actions will need to follow. Respect is not optional." Vernon nodded, swallowing his pride as he gestured toward the manager's office. "Let's discuss how we can move forward." The murmurs in the room grew louder, a chorus of agreement and relief. Staff members exchanged glances, some relieved, others perhaps embarrassed by the episode that had unfolded under their roof. A few stepped forward hesitantly, ready to take notes or assist as the situation transitioned from confrontation to resolution. Vernon led Ezekiel through the double doors to his office, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the lobby behind them. As the doors closed, the customers slowly resumed their business, but the atmosphere lingered heavy with the knowledge of what had just transpired. Inside the office, Vernon sat behind his desk, folding his hands as Ezekiel took a seat across from him. The veteran's expression was calm but unyielding, an embodiment of the dignity that had been challenged and now restored. Vernon cleared his throat again. "I want to assure you, Mr. Ward, that this branch will review its policies and staff training to prevent anything like this from happening again. Ezekiel nodded. That is expected. But more than policies, it is about culture. How people are treated, not just customers, but employees too. Vernon met his eyes, a flicker of sincerity breaking through the remnants of his defensiveness. I understand, and I will personally oversee the changes. They spoke further, words flowing about procedures, respect, and accountability. But beneath the formalities, a new understanding was being forged, one that acknowledged past mistakes and looked toward a better future. Outside the office, a subtle change was taking place as well. The bank's atmosphere, once weighed down by tension and silent judgment, began to lighten. Customers exchanged quiet smiles, some nodding to one another in recognition of the moment's significance. Staff members moved with renewed purpose, their steps more confident, their interactions warmer. Vernon's own posture straightened, the lesson settling in as a quiet resolve to do better, to be better. Ezekiel stood to leave, offering a nod to Vernon that was both a challenge and a promise. Respect earned is respect given, he said. Remember that. The deed that Ezekiel had produced was more than paper. It was a symbol of rightful ownership, a reminder that privilege granted by birth or position could never replace the dignity earned through service and character. Vernon reflected on how he had misused his position, how petty biases had clouded his judgment and led to humiliation, not just for Ezekiel, but for the institution he was charged to uphold. He understood now that leadership was not about asserting dominance or making others feel small. It was about fostering an environment where every individual was valued and treated with fairness. As the first rays of morning filtered through the window blinds, Vernon rose and walked toward the lobby, where a small gathering of employees was already preparing for the day. Their eyes met his, tentative but hopeful, and he offered a nod, a silent promise that the bank would change. The notice posted on the main door announced new policies emphasizing respect and equality, staff training programs aimed at dismantling bias, and open forums for community dialogue. Ezekiel Ward's influence extended beyond ownership. His courage to stand firm had ignited a movement within the walls of that bank, a call for justice that could no longer be ignored. Word spread quickly. Local news picked up the story, praising the veteran not just for his ownership, but for his unyielding dignity in the face of discrimination. The bank's reputation, once tarnished by Vernon's actions, began to recover as efforts to address systemic issues gained momentum. Ezekiel, true to his calm and measured nature, became a respected figure in the community, working alongside Vernon and others to ensure that respect was more than policy, but a lived reality. In one of their first joint meetings, Ezekiel spoke plainly. Respect is not a favor, it's a foundation. When it's missing, everything else crumbles. Vernon listened, humbled and determined to rebuild trust. The bank slowly transformed into a place where diversity was embraced, where customers and employees alike felt seen and heard. Training sessions replaced judgment with understanding. Procedures incorporated fairness over convenience, and the culture began to reflect the true values Ezekiel had championed. Outside the building, a plaque was installed commemorating Ezekiel Ward's service to the community and his role in prompting change, an enduring testament to the power of standing firm against injustice. Vernon often found himself passing the plaque, reminded daily of the lessons learned, of the cost of prejudice, and the strength found in humility. The story that began with disdain ended with a renewed commitment to justice, a promise that no uniform, no status, and no assumption would ever again define worth within those walls. Ezekiel's quiet courage had sparked a revolution not with shouts, but with unwavering dignity, reminding all who witnessed it that true power lies in respect for one another. The bank, once a place of silent exclusion, became a beacon of inclusion, a symbol that justice is not just served but built, one respectful act at a time. Vernon knew this was only the beginning, but the path was clear, marked by accountability, empathy, and a determination to ensure that what happened to Ezekiel would never happen again. And in that, the institution, the community, and the men who once stood opposed found a new understanding, one that transcended conflict and forged a legacy of equality. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking and subscribing for more powerful tales of justice and resilience. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot? Did any part of Ezekiel and Vernon's journey stand out to you? And where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm excited to connect with you.